Welcome back to Men and the City. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the rise of Masco-Nationalism in the West. So, for most of you that have been following me for some time, I made a video about Masco-Nationalism, this idea of a masculine nationalism centered in strong men rising in the East. Well, today we're going to talk about what's happening in the West. This video is going to be fairly long, so if you're listening to this, as per usual, I would save it for a long drive or for a Sunday afternoon when you don't have much going on and you can sit down with some coffee or some tea or equivalent and listen for 20 or 30 minutes. This year is barely a month old and already major events are happening all over the world. But today I want to focus specifically on what's happening in Europe and the United States. The principal function of government is threefold. First is to protect the population. Second is to feed the population. And third is to shelter the population. Now, I mentioned those three elements, the triad, you might say, of political obligation, because governments around the world that fail to heed or to fulfill those obligations crumble. And the West is no exception, despite what you may hear. And ironically, as time has passed, and many of the underlying systems that protect and feed and shelter the population have worsened, or they have deteriorated in very egregious ways. Those issues have fallen, they've been subordinated, they have disappeared from the mainstream in favor of other issues that take priority within the corridors of power, whether that's the EU centered in Brussels or it's the gerontocracies, I call them, the globalists in Washington, D.C. and New York and so forth. And I don't think I have to explain this in much detail. The mainstream press prioritizes a number of stories, the vast majority of which have nothing to do with the three parameters I just defined: protecting the population, feeding the population, and sheltering the population. Instead, they're focused on Israeli national security interests, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Gaza, or they're focused on this Russo-Ukrainian war in Eastern Europe, or they're focused on transsexual rights in various states in the United States, or they're focused on gun rights, as an example. And the issues just go on and on from there. Lost in that confusion is what the function of government must be. It is a preliminary, it is the foundation upon which all other issues become possible. If you can't feed the population, if you can't protect it, if you can't shelter it, forget about the rights of a population. Forget about what are so-called negative rights, free speech, or illegal search and seizure, right? Or the right to privacy, okay? Those things cannot exist unless the building blocks of society are fulfilled: protecting the population, feeding the population, and sheltering the population. And so as those core competencies have withered on the vine over the last several decades, this is not a new development. What has happened is that the bedrock of society has crumbled. Now, we've talked about this on my channel as expressed in gendered politics, this attack on so-called toxic masculinity, the emasculation of men across the spectrum in academia, in the university system, by the mainstream press, in Fortune 500 companies, inside the US military, and so forth and so on. And because men don't represent a activist group, or we don't have nonprofits or other special interests that represent us. In fact, quite the contrary, we are the target of special interests. We are the recipient, you might say, of their backlash. And because men, specifically the deltas, as I've called it, on this hierarchy, the socio-sexual hierarchy, the deltas are the working men, the boots on the ground, the men that do all the work, that lay the concrete, that farm and produce the agricultural goods and commodities that literally feed the population and sustain it. Those men have been left out in the cold, and they've been sold out by the alphas and the betas within this perverse social pyramid, right? The alphas are the C-suite, the chief executive officers, the chief financial officers, the congressmen, members of the executive bureaucracy in various governments. They are in charge of our society. They're the managerial elite. I call them the alphas. And of course, the middle managers underneath them who simply institute or implement their policies, they're the betas, right? The deltas are the linchpin. They're the keystones of the system because they actually do the work, okay? In the military, it would be your rank and file sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines that actually do the fighting. And they're the crucial components. They're not cannon fodder. Without them, you have nothing, okay? Well, because that group has been targeted and maligned and marginalized by an establishment that's been increasingly feminized, that has embraced wokeism and globalism and all the rest of it, that is completely untethered to how society actually functions, that element, the globalists, the gerontocracy and the like, have implemented policies that are utterly ruinous to the deltas. And the blowback from this is beginning to spiral out of control. It's beginning to coalesce into social and political movements that are pushing back. And this is coming to a head both in Europe and in North America. This has not begun this year. It's been a long time coming. We saw evidence for this in the United States in the 2010s with the emergence of the Tea Party that long predated Donald Trump. And these were largely men. It wasn't just men, it was men and women, but it was largely men that were baby boomers. And these were folks that had paid their way into a system for the better part of their lives. And it was increasingly dawning upon them that they weren't going to get their pensions, that the banks had run amok with our society, and ultimately they didn't want their tax dollars to be wasted. And they recognized that fiscal spending was on an unsustainable trajectory, and so they demanded fiscal discipline, and they sought to create a political movement to push back, and they did. It was called the Tea Party. Now that movement, as we know, it failed, but it was the beginning. An analog to that among younger generations was Occupy Wall Street. Now Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party did not share a political philosophy, but they both shared a common grievance, and that was that the system was broken, that it was corrupt, that it was toxic. And following that, you've seen the emergence of the Red Pill, you've seen MAGA in the United States, and various new parties across Europe that have channeled very similar sentiments, that sovereignty has been encroached upon, that immigration has gotten completely out of control, that wokeism manifested in various forms. This explosion of sexual promiscuity and you might say the asymmetric of power of women over men in all its various forms. That has produced these online silos that are growing in number and gaining in momentum. Now, I've talked about the alternative media complex, I've talked about the Manosphere, I've talked about the cryptosphere, which is another iteration of this. All of these are threads of the same overall tapestry. they may not cohere perfectly. They may not fit as harmonious puzzle pieces into a bigger picture at first, but over time they very likely will. So what's happening in Europe right now is that you have an explosion of resistance from farmers and truckers and various other working class groups, laborers, that actually make society function, that are pushing back on political policies that work directly against their interests, that threaten their livelihoods, because they trample upon those three core competencies: to feed the population, to shelter the population, and to protect the population. And this is beginning to get out of hand. In Paris, as we speak, on the outskirts, major highways are being blockaded by thousands of farmers who have driven their tractors and other vehicles hundreds of miles away in some cases to demonstrate and voice their frustration and their anger against not just the local government or the sovereign government, what's left of it, but also against the European Union. And there are many reasons for this, and I'm not going to relitigate all of them, but the short of it is that their sovereignty has been impeded upon, their livelihoods have been compromised, and so they're not left with many outlets other than to voice their frustration. At the same time, this kind of groundswell of resistance is growing in the United States. It started with the truckers a couple years ago. It started with, in some sense, anti-lockdown protests and reaction against mandatory vaccinations. You know, again, there are various iterations of this, but it's beginning to go mainstream. And recently, it's taken another form. It has become part of this broader resistance to the federal government's negligence on immigration in the United States. There are similar voices of dissent growing in Canada, albeit smaller in scale. And this has recently caused friction between the governor of Texas, a guy named Abbott, and the federal government, which is intent on doing nothing about illegal immigration except making it worse, as we all know. And so the governor of Texas had finally had enough, and he decided to use his legal mandate, according to the Constitution, according to the 10th Amendment, which empowers the states to more or less do whatever isn't specifically defined in the Constitution as falling to the federal government, to protect his population in Texas. And so he is deploying, over the objections of the federal government, local law enforcement to stop tens of thousands in any given day or month, and hundreds of thousands and millions over the course of months and years from coming into this country. And of course, this comes after decades of a mass deluge of migrants flowing into the United States, largely from the southern border. And of course, we don't know how many of these people are here in the United States, just as the Europeans don't know how many are in Europe. So all of this is beginning to come to a head, and it's gaining in mainstream coverage and momentum, and you're starting to see a real bifurcation of authority. Now, I sent out a tweet about this, which I'm going to show on the screen, that reads as follows, and this is specifically about what's happening in Texas. I said, "End of the Republic is nigh. A state of exception in which legacy authority collapses and parallel authority rises triggers a new era, one not defined by secession but by a neo-American nationalism that will reconsolidate executive power to achieve reformation. Fireworks ahead." So that falls in line with things that I've said over the last 6+ months on this channel and things that I've written about for some time. And it's not breaking news. What is breaking news is that you're beginning to see a convergence of long-term incompetency, mismanagement, and in some cases, a planned demolition of certain sectors of society led by men, led by the deltas, whether it's the agricultural sector or it's manufacturing in the United States, spearheaded by truckers and United automakers. Again, these are the folks that make our society run. Without them, everything falls apart. And of course, the gerontocracy, the globalists, have nothing but contempt for these people, which is why they've implemented the policies that they have. However, what is beginning to change now is that the legacy structure is careening out of control. They have engineered a very self-destructive environment in which the societies that they preside over are extremely fragile. And of course, they can't see this because they don't really understand what society is anymore. That fragility is more than just a fiscal situation that's spiraling out of control. It's more than simply recessionary symptoms that may be ignored in the mainstream, but are increasingly self-evident to anybody that cares to pay attention, whether it's tent cities or it's numbers of layoffs that are surging in various sectors and beginning to spread beyond, Wall Street and the tech sector and so forth and so on. It's encompassing the social problems as well, the toxicity in the sexual marketplace, the conflict domestically that has a direct consequence of mass immigration, right? The balkanization that is increasingly acrimonious across the West, whether it's in Australia or the United States or Canada, the Anglosphere or the United Kingdom, or it's in Europe itself. So this is a very combustible situation that's beginning to ignite. As this process unfolds, we are in very fraught territory because we're in a transition. As incompetent and as egregiously mismanaged as the legacy structure is, it has not toppled yet, now has it? And so the government itself, the federal government, these international institutions and nonprofits and so forth still wield tremendous power. And very soon, these opposition movements, whether it's the governor in Texas deploying, local law enforcement to the border, or it's the truckers barricading the outskirts of Paris and seemingly cutting off food to Parisians that depend upon it, or it's confrontations that are intensifying in countries like Germany or in Belgium or in Italy, friction between the European Union and its various cronies in local governments and a growing majority of these populations that have had enough. The backlash from the government is coming. Now, how strong will that backlash be? How exacting will it be? In other words, will people go to jail? Will people in some cases be killed by authorities because they're perceived as subversive and rebellious and anarchic? That's hard to say, but that backlash is coming. And so the fight, the fireworks, the friction, this combustion that has begun is going to intensify this year. It's already doing so. How does all of this resolve itself? Well, I want to read a couple quotes to you that come from the fourth turning yet again, because I think it does an excellent job of framing where we are in this cyclical disruption that we're living through, what they call the fourth turning. And remember that they deconstruct societies, civilizations, whatever you want to call them, in terms of these 80-year cycles, these 80-year demarcations that they call seculums. And according to the fourth turning, the United States has 3 seculums from 1776 to today, more or less. I would argue that we actually have 5, because I would start the history of the United States at 1620, not at 1776, and there are various reasons for that. But in any case, we are at a crucial period in which many of the ideas that came to define our countries, not just the United States, but you might say the modern iteration of Europe, the emergence of the European Union and the Euro, this confederated international union, and are responsible for the ideas that underpin it, whether it's democracy or it's human rights. These are ideas that go back 3, 4, or 5 seculums. They are soon to be tested. And they're going to be tested maybe fundamentally. We may have to reevaluate what our constitutional framework of government is. And in fact, I think that's what's going to happen. So listen to what the authors of The Fourth Turning have to say. Quote, "The opportunity will arise for a third party to fill the void, after which one or both of today's 2 dominant parties could go the way of the Whigs." Now they're talking about, in that sentence, they're talking about the Republicans and Democrats in the United States. But let's generalize that quote to apply to all of Europe, because it does. So I'm going to continue here. Quote, "History warns that when a crisis catalyzes, a previously dominant political party or regime can find itself directly blamed for perceived mistakes that led to the national emergency. Whoever holds power when the Fourth Turning arrives could join the unlucky roster of the Lancastrians, the Catholics circa 1570, the Stuarts in 1680, the Tories in 1770, the Democrats in 1860 before the Civil War, the Republicans in 1929 before the Great Depression. That party, the one in power, could find itself out of power for a generation. Key persons associated with it could find themselves defamed, stigmatized, harassed, economically ruined, personally punished, or worse." This brings us back to the state of exception that I covered in a video over the summer, and I'll link to that below. We are headed for a power vacuum. We're headed for a implosion, if you will. What's actually happening is that the current regime that is in power and has more or less consolidated control of all of these governments is imploding before our eyes. And that creates a very dangerous situation. It creates that state of exception, that emergency circumstance in which the public is increasingly aware that the corridors of power have no answers to these problems. And that brings me to what happens next. Increasingly, as resistance movements spread, as they flower across the West and they start to assimilate various groups into their rank and file, as I've talked about on this channel before, as the rank and file of the blue pill diminish in number and the rank and file of the red pill grow in number, we're going to start to see backlash from the government. We haven't really seen that yet, but it's coming. And that reactivity is what ultimately will bring them down. Now, it may not seem that way at first. It may not appear as though the resistance, this Masco-Nationalism, as I've talked about in various forms, as the Delta armies grow, may not appear initially as though we can possibly win or that our forces, that our side will prevail. Because, you might say, the empire will strike back, right? The gerontocracy, the globalists and so forth, they'll start arresting people, or worse, we don't know. But when they react, they're almost certainly going to overreact, much like previous monarchs have in previous revolutionary periods that have come before us, whether it was King George III overreacting to demands from the colonies, many demands that appeared quite reasonable inside the Parliament in England. In fact, remember that the colonists had many sympathizers inside the British government, okay? Very similar overreactions or reactivity beleaguered the French monarchy in the lead up to the French Revolution. Louis XVI was not a very competent monarch. He wasn't a tyrant, but he didn't really understand how to deal with this explosive situation in which increasingly the Third Estate was aligned against him. And remember, the history of France is basically the king, the monarch, and the peasants unified together against the aristocracy. Well, he found himself increasingly isolated, and then boom, the most powerful monarch in the world at that time, Louis XVI, in the most powerful country in the world at that time, France, with the largest and most prosperous middle class at that time, the French middle class, found itself in an extremely dangerous situation that unfolded very, very quickly. What I'm suggesting to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are living in similar times. And so what comes next is how these governments in various forms and these international institutions are going to react, or, in my view, overreact to these resistance movements, rather than hearing them out, rather than implementing root and branch reforms that could pacify some of these groups. Whether it's abandoning this environmental activism, right, that's banning synthetic fertilizers and jeopardizing the food supply chains that feed not just Europe but the world, or de-escalating conflict in the Middle East that the West, and specifically the United States, are almost certainly going to be drawn into, or it's coming to terms with what's happened in Eastern Europe, which is to say that Ukraine, or at least the majority of it, is now going to be controlled by the Russians. Rather than accepting these permutations and reconsolidating around reforms that are so desperately needed, again, stopping the mass influx of immigration and deporting large numbers of people that are here illegally, these are reforms that could absolutely salvage the situation. Rather than doing that, we know, I think we can say with confidence, that they're going to double down. They're going to escalate. They're going to jail people, or worse. So in the weeks and months ahead, pay very keen attention to the broadening out of these resistance groups, this Masco-Nationalism that's rising in the West, and how governments react or overreact to that. Because that overreaction, just as you might say the election of Abraham Lincoln and the extreme position of the abolitionists pushed the United States into civil war, we are going to see a similar overreaction in the United States and in Europe and in Canada. And that's going to force a lot of these issues to the forefront. And that will implode the government. It will lead to a power vacuum. And that will then create the opportunity for, as I've said before, Masco-Nationalism to consolidate into this neo-masculine movement that, with any luck, will implement a reformation and salvage a desperate situation. But that process is going to be very ugly. It's going to be fraught with peril. It's going to be tumultuous. There's going to be fits and starts, as they say. There's going to be 1 or 2 or 3 steps forward, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 steps backward. That is the nature of the reform or the revolutionary period that we're in. And make no mistake, that is precisely the word to use here, folks. So, that's a lot to digest. But I want to leave you with the following sentiment. When the interval of the intellectual classes and the practical classes is too great, the former will possess no influence and the latter will reap no benefits. That comes from a British historian named Henry Thomas Buckle. The intellectual classes, today we call them the globalists. I call them the gerontocracy, ruled by old. They are on the cusp of a catastrophe, and they don't see it coming. And that is what ultimately will lead to their downfall and catalyze the change that we've discussed today. 2024 is going to be a year to remember, and the 2020s will be a decade that's going to change the Western world and the individual countries that comprise it in ways that I think are truly spectacular, and looking back will be somewhat logical, but looking forward appear today unbelievable. What will you do in the months and years ahead? That's what you need to think about. Those of us that take action will gain in power. Those of us that don't will shrink. We will diminish in power. And remember that over the last several decades, doing nothing, conforming, groupthink, going with the flow and consensus, that's how you got ahead. But henceforth, that's not going to work anymore. Dynamism, courage, character, intelligence, agency, those are the things going forward that are going to prevail. And of course, polarity. So, stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.